Forgive and forget, not according to the thousands of Tunisians who marched against the draft law letting corrupt businessmen off the hook. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Tunisia's Amnesty bill. It was the spark that lit North Africa and the Middle East ablaze more than 6 years ago. And now Tunisia seems ready to turn the page on longtime autocrat Zain al-Abidine bin Ali, who fled the country during that upheaval. But there's a catch. For some lawmakers, closing the book on the bin Ali era means granting amnesty to thousands of businessmen who acquired billions of dollars in illicit funds during his reign. All they have to do is return the money. But thousands of Tunisians have rejected the very idea of amnesty. They support the Prime Minister's anti-corruption efforts, but not policies that will forgive past economic crimes. Many have said that amnesty goes against the very spirit of the 2011 Tunisian revolution. Will this bill inject much-needed cash into the Tunisian economy, or is it pardoning a corrupted class that will go back to business as usual? Natalie Perhonen tells us more.
Tunisians are sounding off against the government's proposal to grant amnesty to people accused of corruption if they return illicitly gained funds to the nation.
I won't forgive, either for my rights, nor the rights of the Tunisian people, the martyrs' rights, the jobless rights, nor our rights to our resources. I won't forgive the robbers who could be whitewashed.
This draft law allows corrupt people to come back with more power. Second, it's unconstitutional. Third, the president thinks in Tunisia is business as usual, but many things have changed.
President Beji Said Essebsi first introduced the draft Economic Reconciliation Law in 2015. It was meant to be a way to boost investment by re-injecting money embezzled by businessmen during the rule of deposed leader Zain al-Abidine bin Ali. The proposed bill sparked outcry then, and it's continuing to do that now, because ordinary Tunisians and civil society groups have been demanding accountability for the crimes. They argue that true justice can't take place if amnesty is granted. While there's been strong criticism for that proposal, there has been praise for the Prime Minister's announcement last week to tackle current allegations of corruption.
في الحرب على الفساد ما فماش خيارات، يا الفساد يا الدولة، يا الفساد يا تونس. وانا كيف التوانسة كل اخترت الدولة واخترت تونس.
Since the fall of the Ben Ali regime, Tunisians have been confronting decades of past abuse. The Truth and Dignity Commission is modelled after similar commissions in South Africa and Morocco. It's an independent body publicly investigating allegations of torture, rights violations and corruption, which took place between July 1955 to December 2013. In open and televised hearings, victims have been telling their stories.
We want truth and dignity. This is the only hope we cling to.
But the Commission says there's a fundamental problem, a lack of state cooperation.
We are calling on the Interior Minister and the state to revise their position, rejecting all the requests of judgment and reconciliation sent by their victims.
Raising further doubts about the government's willingness to address actions of the past, including corruption, so that Tunisia's people can have justice. Natalie Perhonen, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss further, I'm joined now from Tunis by Khalid Diab, a journalist and author of the forthcoming book, Islam for the Politically Incorrect, and Ahmed Bouazi. He's the co-founder of the Democratic Alliance Party. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Ahmed, let me begin with you. Is this bill a good idea?
Yes. I think that the Commission of Truth and Dignity was made to avoid a civil war, to avoid revenge from people whose goods were looted or whose body was tortured, and we don't want them to take justice themselves. So we want this commission to try to have reconciliation between the aggressors and the aggressors, between the looters and the thieves, and the state or private people.
Okay, so Ahmed, if you stole billions of dollars from the Tunisian people during the Ben Ali regime, you enriched yourself and you took the money out of the country, and now you just have to bring it back and there's amnesty, nothing will be done to you. Sounds like a fantastic deal if you were corrupt. And the very nature of the Ben Ali regime, right? This was not a country of gulags. The very nature of the regime, people were rising up against that corruption, right? So it's basically saying, if you were corrupt, it's fine, we forgive you, come back and contribute. Sounds fantastic if you're corrupt, right, Ahmed?
No, it's not enough, because we have to dismantle the mechanism of corruption and to know how they could take all this money out from the state and out to take it abroad. And we want to know the other part of the system, and so we can avoid for the future any further corruption.
Okay, Khalid Diab, economic reconciliation. It might be controversial, but it's a way to revive the economy, inject some of this money into the economy. At some point, you have to start from somewhere and press reset. What do you think?
I'm not sure it will actually revive the economy. I mean, there's no evidence to suggest that this kind of amnesty will necessarily revive Tunisia's economic fortunes, because it will only deliver a fraction of the money that was embezzled. On top of that, you can't dismantle the infrastructure of corruption by offering those who were involved in that corruption amnesty. You know, it's just a contradiction in terms. You know, it can't happen that way.
Yes, Ahmed, thousands of people have protested against them. Is the government not listening to them? They're saying this is re-injecting Ben Ali's Tunisia into the system. We've moved on, 6 years on, we've moved on. Why are you bringing him back into the system? That's why those thousands of people have taken to the streets. Why doesn't the government listen?
I think the government listened twice, but he's trying again and again to bring this law in the assembly. And people are marching again and again against this law, because in fact it is a kind of laundering the old regime and bringing back into place old corrupted people and all corruptors that made the fortune of the Ben Ali's family and people who were making traffic with them. I mean, economic traffic and
you can understand why people are so angry, right? This is bringing them back in. You can understand why they're so angry. Do you accept their anger?
Yes, they have the right to be angry. They were marching, and these people are really young people, and they are not organized in parties. They are just organized to push the country into a good future, and to bring it, to let it come back to the old regime.
Okay.
And they are very, very active, and they are they are determined to stop this law.
Okay, so Khalid, people have been forgiven for leading death squads in other countries. We've seen truth and reconciliation for admitted and convicted killers. So why not some sort of reconciliation for those who stole money?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, I think Tunisia, as a start, doesn't require any new law. I mean, it already has a mechanism in place for dealing with past abuses and corruption. You know, what could happen if a businessman shows remorse, or a businesswoman, or someone who is involved in embezzlement shows remorse and comes before the Truth and Dignity Commission and says, you know, I show remorse, I understand the crimes I committed, I apologize to the people I wronged and to the state, maybe then you can lighten their sentence. But they have justice needs to be served. Other experiments where justice was not served fully, further down the line caused problems. In South Africa, for example, you know, the apartheid era economic and social inequalities are still in place, largely, partly because of the failure to address fully past transgressions and past infringements and crimes.
Yeah, it's interesting.
On top of that,
no, it's good that you mentioned
financial
sure. Finish your
crime.
point.
Yes. So also like financial crimes are intimately interwoven, as many experts have shown, with political crime. You know, state abuse, you know, from police brutality to arrest to repression, are often done to protect an elite, you know, from public oversight over their crony capitalism and their theft of state resources.
Okay, and some interesting points made there. And one of the counter-arguments, especially with South Africa, is people said, well, the reason there was truth and reconciliation was precisely, as Ahmed says, as well, to prevent a civil war. Whether it worked out well in the end is up for the historians, I guess, to say. Let's broaden this out now and bring in Amna Gwelali. She's the senior Tunisia and Algeria researcher for Human Rights Watch. Amna, good of you to join the conversation. Tell me why Human Rights Watch doesn't like this bill.
Well, we don't like this bill, and we opposed it since the beginning. So since it was first proposed by President Sibsi in 2015, because we believe that it would be a blow to transitional justice and a blow to the democratic process in Tunisia as a whole. Why we believe that? Because the system of corruption and state plunder of state funds and cronyism that existed under the Ben Ali regime and was systematic, it is very important to dismantle this system, to understand what were the networks of corrupt people that made it possible and made it happen, and that it is not through an amnesty bill or a pardon bill that such a process could take place, that we need a process of transitional justice in order to deal with the abuses that happened in the past, including economic abuses. We believe that such a bill, which is granting amnesty for corrupt business people and also state officials in return of, in exchange of returned assets, will in effect blur the whole picture of the transitional justice process. It will undermine the work of a commission which exists already and has made headways and quite milestone steps in order to do transitional justice and perform its task despite the opposition from many leaders in the country, and that such a bill will not enable Tunisian people to understand the truth of what happened, of the networks of corruption that existed. It will not also help Tunisian people and Tunisian institutions, Tunisian state, in fact, to dismantle this system and to build a new country that is based on other principles and not on corruption and plunder of state funds.
Okay, so that was well laid out. Let's bring in Ahmed here. Ahmed, my first question to you, I asked you, do you think the bill was a good idea? You said yes. After you've heard what Amna said, I mean, she made a fantastic case for all the worries about this bill. Is that enough for you to change your mind? That was a compelling case.
No, I think I agree with Amna, and I think that the transitional justice presented a good deal for corrupted people, because the sentences are not heavy as if they go in a civil tribunal. Let's take, for instance, some ministers, former Minister of Defense, for example, and some other ministers for public domain and so on. They have a heavy sentence of 6 years of jail. And if they went to the transitional justice, they will never have this heavy sentence. They will only present, they will only recognize what they made, what the wrong things that they made.
So Ahmed,
what was wrong, and
have you changed your mind? Have you changed your mind? Are you now against this bill?
And I am against the bill of the President of the Republic, the bill to just have an amnesty for corrupted people. Because in the transitional justice, they need an inquiry to check if the money they said they have to take away is the right amount of money, or there are many other amounts of money that they were trying to hide, to not give back to the state.
Okay. Amna, when we look at this holistically, Tunisia says, you know, they've declared a war on corruption. Just last week, there was news that 3 businessmen were arrested, plus a customs officer suspected of graft, and so on. Holistically speaking, I know you're against this bill, but in recent times, has the government been doing well in fighting corruption?
I mean, there were already several steps undertaken
Please continue,
since
Amna.
quite some time already in order to fight corruption. The government has made some, important steps last week by arresting some of the corrupt businessmen and other state officials. Now what we need to see is whether these steps will be followed by real and deep reforms in the economic sector and in other sectors in Tunisia. But to go back to the bill, I think the fact that the government has made these steps and has, started in a way to fight corruption by making these quite impressive, arrests, is in contradiction with the bill, bill that is proposed by the presidency on offering amnesty for corrupt businessmen. These 2 steps are in contradiction with one another, and so if the government wants to show to the Tunisian public opinion and to the Tunisian people that they are really serious about fighting corruption, they need to, take this bill off the table and start a new, conversation about what to do with corruption. This bill is, in a way, will undermine all the state efforts to fight corruption. So what they have to do now is just suspend it, not come back to it again, like they did in these past 2 years. Every time that the Tunisian public and the Tunisian protesters went to the streets in order to call on the government not to pass this bill in the parliament, they kind of retracted and put it on hold, but then it came back and revived it from its ashes again and again. So what we need to see right now is just that this bill should be killed once and for every time, and not have it come back again and again at the level of the parliament, because this is losing the time that is very precious for the Tunisian people to fight corruption.
Okay, Khalid, let me ask you about Ennahda, because we expect Nida Tunis to support it as a sort of ruling party, but there's been some criticism about Ennahda and them being very lukewarm in their response to the bill. Some members saying they're against it, many supporting it. Tell me why Ennahda hasn't spoken out against this bill, Khalid.
Well, it's difficult to say, but I think in Nahda, like Tunisian society as a whole, is very polarized and divided. I mean, there's a kind of polarization between people. I mean, in Nahda, its rise I don't think they wanted a radical change in society. Theirs was more a cultural change that they were trying to implement. They didn't want to change the neoliberal, economics that have guided Tunisia. So that could be a part of the explanation for the lukewarm reception. In Tunisian society as a whole, there's a growing polarization of how the past is perceived, and that's why unearthing the truth about the past is so important. A mythology is growing up and emerging that the Ben Ali years were less corrupt than now,
right,
and that things functioned better, the state functioned better.
But think about this, Khalid, and I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Weren't on the take as much.
Sure, I'm sorry to interrupt you, right? You say it's mythology, right? But I've got Transparency International in front of me here. And so Tunisia ranked 75th out of more than 170 countries in the 2016 Corruption Perceptions Index. So this is not just Tunisians, it's outsiders, it's those who do business, those who invest in the country. It had been 59th in 2010, right? So then that suggests that the country was less corrupt under a corrupt dictator. Tell me.
Yeah, but you touched on... No, you touched on the key word. Well, what Transparency International measures is perception.
Right.
And because there's more openness now, there's more transparency in Tunisia, so, and Tunisians have become more critical because of their new freedom, every transgression is much more visible than it used to be. It was, most of the body of the beast during the Ben Ali era was submerged underground. It was only hearsay, that made people aware of corruption. Today, there's a commission, there are citizens who will post about it, who will talk about it, the media debates corruption on a daily basis, so perception has become a lot better. So that doesn't mean corruption in itself has become, it's become more in the open rather than increased in magnitude.
Okay.
So I think, and that in a way is a good sign. That means Tunisians are aware of the problem and they're battling it.
Yep.
By offering amnesty, you're going to, and the president is part of the old order actually. So by him proposing to offer amnesty, he's kind of trying to turn back the clock somewhat in Tunisia, and that is unacceptable.
Okay, I'll let that be the final word, but good point that you make there. With freedom comes a bit more chaos and complaints from people. Maybe the perception then sort of gets worse. It's been fascinating talking to all of you, Khalid Diab, Amna Gwelali and Ahmed Bouazi. Thank you very much for joining us. Still ahead, we explore Israel's secret plan to preserve the Jewish majority in Jerusalem. And martial law is imposed on the southern Philippines. Are the measures warranted? Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Israeli sources have revealed a secret plan that would separate the Shafat refugee camp and surrounding neighborhoods from the Jerusalem municipality. Kafr Aqab, which lies north of the city, would also be affected. The reasoning behind that, according to the source, to preserve Jerusalem's Jewish majority. If the plans go through, the 140,000 Palestinian residents who live in the camp and surrounding town would lose their Israeli citizenship. Israel's Channel 10 reported that the plans will separate the areas administratively and merge them into a single entity outside Jerusalem, but will still be under full Israeli control. The Shafat refugee camp and Kafr Aqab have long suffered neglect, with poor services and interruption in power and water supplies being the norm. Will this scheme alleviate those poor conditions and improve governance? Or is it a plot to drastically shrink the city's Palestinian population? And with 140,000 Palestinians under threat of losing their Israeli citizenship, how will that affect Israel's future elections and demographics? Well, joining me now from Tel Aviv is Dan Shoeftan. He's an Israeli academic and chairman of the National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa. And from Ramallah, Dr. Mustafa Barghouti. He's a Palestinian physician, activist and politician who serves as General Secretary of the Palestine National Initiative. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Mustafa Barghouti, what do you make of these new plans for Jerusalem?
It's part of a systematic approach that Israel has been using since 50 years, which is to try to Judaize not just the East Jerusalem, which was occupied by Israel, but also the rest of the West Bank. What Israel is trying to do is to systematically falsify the past, the history, and falsify the existing situation with the hope that the future will also be falsified. And in my opinion, Israel is violating international law, and this is not only my opinion, this is the opinion of so many organizations in this world. This is the opinion of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which represents the highest court in the world, and which indicated that all Israeli measures in Jerusalem, whether building settlements inside the city or around it, whether changing facts on the ground, whether building the wall, or the process of appropriation of Palestinian properties is violating the international law and should be reversed. One more thing, I think after these 50 years of occupation, what we witness today is a system of apartheid, a system of racial discrimination against Palestinian people that affects not only Palestinians in Jerusalem, but in Palestine in total.
Okay, Dan Shweftan, systematic plan has been going on for 50 years. This is apartheid changing the facts on the ground. How do you see it?
Look, I don't think I should take seriously the kind of accusations and complaints and excuses that Palestinians substitute for foreign policy. Let me say this: Jerusalem has been the center of Jewish life for 3,000 years.
Why can't you take it seriously?
We have today a city that... Because it's a bunch of lies and complaints that you can't take seriously, and I don't want to waste my time on them. But
I think, sir, you are lying now, because you cannot accuse others of being liars. This is unacceptable. And
Dr. Barghouti, give him a chance, and then you can jump back. Dr. Barghouti, give him a chance to finish, and then you can jump back.
If you say I am a liar, you are a bigger liar.
Palestinians, I think Palestinians have to learn to be civilized in a discussion, and in this discussion, please let me say whatever I want.
Well, being civilized doesn't mean you say that we are saying lies.
Dr. Barghouti, give him a chance. Let him finish. I'll give you an opportunity to come back. Go ahead, sir.
But I don't allow him to say that we are lying.
Okay.
Certainly, and that's noted.
Now, if you will not, of course you're lying. You're systematically lying every time you speak. But if...
Then you are not civilized.
Okay. I stand on this, and if you will, look, if you will let me speak, fine. If not, can you please put him off the air so that we can have an intelligent discussion?
Dr. Barghouti, if you give him a chance to do 2 or 3 sentences, and then you can come back, right? So, sir, Dan Shweftan, let's talk about the specifics here. You've said he's lying, and you've said you don't take what he says seriously. Let me ask you about this particular plan, right, where 140,000 people might lose their Israeli citizenship. And there's a plan, some might see it as gerrymandering, changing facts on the ground in East Jerusalem. How do you see that? Is there room for criticism for that?
Look, there is no right that Palestinians have to become Israeli citizens. When part of these neighborhoods became under Israeli rule 50 years ago, they were given not citizenship, but permanent residence in this area. They could apply for citizenship, very few have. So you will not remove citizenship from him. But again, if you take parts of the city and they will no longer be parts of Israel, of course, the Palestinians living in them will not have permanent residence in Jerusalem. This is evidence. Now, you don't need a secret plan for it. This is what could happen. If it will happen, there will be public debate in Israel about it, since this is an open society and everything comes out in the open. I will be delighted if it happens, because it means Jerusalem will be smaller, but it will contain much less Palestinians. So if the Palestinians really want to become citizens of Israel, this is a new game, and we have to discuss it again.
Okay.
But what is happening in Jerusalem is you have Jews and you have Arabs, and the Arabs don't have a right to become Israeli citizens unless their part is part of the state of Israel.
Okay, so you've made your point. Now let's bring in Mustafa Barghouti. Mustafa Barghouti, you don't have a right, you don't have a say. This is Israel's. They annexed it in 1980. It's their city. They can do what they want to with it.
This is Israel, and this is
that's
apartheid.
Not what I
exactly.
Said. I said
imagine
that
a situation. Imagine a situation. Imagine a situation where Greece. Will you shut up so that I can speak now? Shut up. Imagine a situation where Greece is occupying now a Turkish city, let's say Istanbul. And then they declare that the residents of Istanbul are not residents of their own city, but they are temporary residents. And then they take away their land, they take away their homes, and then they tell them you don't have the right to be in Istanbul. This is exactly what Israel is doing to Jerusalem. They occupied the city in 1967 illegally, by force, by war, which is a violating of international law. And then they annexed the land and declared the citizens as temporary residents. And then if they are taking away their right to be residents of the city.
Okay.
This is not only apartheid, this is a criminal act in every possible way.
Okay.
And I think we will hold them responsible. One day, they will be responsible for war crimes that they are committing against Palestinians by establishing and sustaining this system of apartheid.
Okay, if you'd allow me, if we can just agree on some baselines of this discussion. Now, you both have different historical arguments backing your claims. But if we can, because you took issue with me saying Israel annexed it in 1980, you can do what you want to. I'm not making this up myself.
No.
Israel did annex it in 1980. Nobody else recognizes Jerusalem as the united capital of Israel except for Israel. So I'm only mentioning it as a fact based on UN mandates. I'm not making this up. So can we accept that the annexation happened and that nobody else recognizes it except for Israel, sir?
Yes, but that's not the point. You see,
tell me why I'm wrong.
The question is, if Arabs whose neighborhoods are not part of Israel, if one day Israel will say, here is a neighborhood in Jerusalem, and we no longer want it as part of Israel. In that case, the people living there, the way they got their permanent residence, will lose their permanent residence. They got it because this
Why don't you leave East Jerusalem in general?
And they will lose
Why do you keep East Jerusalem? Why do you keep Al-Aqsa Mosque?
If this guy cannot have
this is Palestinian land.
Why do you
cannot make an argument?
Sure.
Why don't you get out of all occupied territories?
Both of you, please.
This person needs to learn how to make a civilized discussion.
Okay, Mr. Shweftan, give me a second.
If he will not let me speak, then there is no point of me being
I don't want that to happen.
Can you please put his microphone off so
I don't want to do
we
that.
can have an interesting discussion.
I don't want to do that.
Then I can listen to whatever he says.
Okay, good. So I don't want to...
This is not a way that you can have a civilized discussion.
Accepted. I don't want to cut anybody's microphone.
Because you are not
and I don't want both of you talking over each other. So, Dr. Barghouti, if you'd give him 30 seconds, please, to make his point, and then you can come back in. Please, sir. Okay, Dan Shweftan, please, make your point, sir.
Again, these people got Israeli permanent residence when their neighborhoods became part of the Israeli Jerusalem. If one day, and by the way, there is no plan for it, and I'm sorry there is no plan for it, but there is no plan for it. But if one day, say Beit Hanina or Shawafat will no longer be part of Israel, then the people living in Beit Hanina and in Shawafat will no longer have permanent residence inside Israel. It is self-evident, and it only stands to reason. I mean, if somebody wants to say that Palestinians have the right to have permanent residence in Israel because they feel like it, even if their neighborhoods are not part of Israel, I think it's a ridiculous argument.
Okay, Mustafa Barghouti, why not accept them being absorbed under the Palestinian Authority and hopefully they become citizens of a Palestinian state in a two-state solution?
We don't want to be part of Israel. We don't want to have residency in Israel, but they are occupying our land. East Jerusalem is occupied by Israel. They have to get out of all East Jerusalem, including the old city, which is Palestinian by international law. They have to end the occupation, and then nobody will have a problem with them. But the reality is that they annexed all these territories, then they squeezed the people inside the old city and inside big parts of Jerusalem. They don't give them the rights to build. They don't allow them to build in these places. They force them to go out to these neighborhoods around Jerusalem. And after they went out, now they want to cut these areas and say to them, you are no more residents of your own city, Jerusalem. Let me tell you, I was born in Jerusalem. I was a doctor in Jerusalem for 15 years. Since 2005, when I ran for president, they deny me the right to visit Jerusalem, where I was born. East Jerusalem is not Israel. By international law, East Jerusalem is occupied. We want East Jerusalem to be free and part of the Palestinian state, like all occupied territories. Otherwise, if Israel wants to kill the two-state solution, and if they continue to consolidate this system of apartheid, then they are calling for one-state solution. Okay, in which case, I have the right to live in Jaffa, because Jaffa was part of the Palestinian state according to partition plan of the United Nations, which is, of course, denied by Israel.
Okay, so Dan Shweiftan, if Israel continues to, if I understand Dr. Barghouti correctly, if Israel continues to separate and distinguish between East Jerusalem and the West Bank and say, okay, the West Bank is occupied, but East Jerusalem is not, according to Mustafa Barghouti, that means Israel doesn't believe in the two-state solution. What do you think?
Look, the Palestinians were offered the Palestinian state again and again and again and rejected it always. They rejected it in 1947 in order to destroy the Jews and kill the Jews. They said it very openly.
This is not true.
They rejected it in the year 2000 in Camp David. They rejected it. You see, he's making a civilized discussion impossible by not letting anybody else speak.
Because you are lying. Because you are now lying very clearly and bluntly.
This is, you see.
Okay. If you both have different interpretations of whether it was accepted or rejected.
You are being racist.
I don't want to say
Palestinian culture is much better than your culture.
Uncivilized person.
Hold on for a second.
With an uncivilized person.
Okay.
An uncivilized person does not belong in a discussion.
You are arrogant,
Mr. Barghouti. I've chaired these debates for years, and I know you both disagree on the fundamentals of it. One says it wasn't an offer, one says it was rejected. That's fine. Can we please, Dr. Barghouti, let the man finish his point? You believe that it's not true what he's saying. He says the Palestinians rejected a state. That's where you differ. But let him finish his point. Let's move beyond that. Dan Shweiftan, go ahead.
It's not true.
Anybody who's not profoundly distorted knows that, and by the way, Palestinian literature confirms it, political literature, that in 1948 the Palestinians rejected the partition plan and wanted to bring about destruction over the Jews. They said it openly. The leader cooperated with the Nazis, Haj Amin al-Husseini, a very good friend of Adolf Hitler. They worked together. These people later made war against Israel, and this is what caused the occupation in 1967. They were offered a Palestinian state in Camp David in the year 2000. They were offered again a Palestinian state in 2008 by
But does that mean, Mr. Shweiftan, that the occupation must continue forever?
They will never get as much as they were offered in the past. They rejected everything.
Does it mean it must continue forever,
They claim what they call the right of return, namely the destruction of Israel by demographic means. There will not be an agreement because the Palestinians don't want an agreement, are incapable of taking responsibility for their own future. In the past, they believed that the Arab armies will get Palestine for them. Now they believe that Europe or the support of leftist elements in the world will get a Palestinian state
Dan
for them.
Let me ask you.
It will not work.
Okay, so
they
does
don't
that
want
mean
an agreement. Israel has no partner for an agreement.
Does that mean the occupation must just continue indefinitely because the Palestinians are not ready to be unoccupied, in your opinion?
Look, my own political position is unilateral disengagement. I suggested it in Gaza. I'm delighted we did it. We got out unilaterally. What we got there is a barbaric state of terrorism with about almost half the Palestinian people. These barbarians want to kill Israeli children more than they want to give their children a better future. And I would want to get out of most of the West Bank, not because the Palestinians deserve it, not because it will bring peace, but because I don't want to cohabitate with them in one political entity. I hope very much we will do it unilaterally, because I'm afraid there is no Palestinian partner for any kind of agreement.
Okay, Mustafa Barghouti, final word from you, sir, please. We're running out of time. Go ahead.
Unfortunately, what you have heard is very clear racist approach of people who think they are better than others, of people who try to degrade the Palestinian people. They don't respect our lives, they don't respect our culture, they don't respect our political opinions, and everything he said are lies. In 1947, Israel did not accept also the partition plan. And Avi Shleim, who's an Israeli historian, proved it, that there was no one document that shows that Israel accepted 1947 plan. Second, 67 war was conducted by Israel against Syria, against Jordan, and against the Palestinians, and against Egypt. It was Israel that launched the attack, and this is a well-established historical fact. Third, Israel is the only country in the world, and I challenge the person you are talking to tell me what are the borders of Israel. Israel is the only country in the world that never says what are their borders. And that's why they don't do so, because they want to keep expanding at the expense of other people's territories.
We are severely out of time here. I've got to cut elsewhere in the program now. So, gentlemen, I thank you for your time. Thanks so much. The Philippines has seen its fair share of unrest over the past few decades, but in the eyes of Philippine authorities, it may have reached a point that requires the suspension of basic rights. They say the threat from rebel groups is so great that martial law might even be extended to the whole country, not just the rebellious south, where it was implemented last week. The epicenter of that violence has been the city of Marawi, where a siege to root out militants left at least 19 dead over the weekend. Making matters worse, the Philippine government says the rebels are linked to Daesh and could pose a threat to the entire nation. Randolph Nogel reports.
If I think that you should die, you will die. If you fight us, you will die. If there's an open defiance, you will die. And if it means many people dying, so be it.
Another front line against Daesh may be developing in the Philippines. President Rodrigo Duterte has declared martial law in Mindanao, the second largest island. Thousands of people have been driven out by fighting between the military and fighters allegedly linked to Daesh.
Alis na talaga kami. Maraming ISIS sa labas ng pintuan na ng bahay namin. Hindi na namin kaya. Tsaka kailangan masave itong mga bata.
Mindanao, plagued by poverty and lawlessness, has become fertile ground for violence. But some of the Muslim population there, the largest in the Philippines, now fear they could be targeted in the military crackdown. Philippine Solicitor General Jose Calida has said that Daesh has a dream to create a province there, adding that the government is not the only target, and that Daesh have radicalized a number of Filipino Muslim youth. Since taking office last year, Duterte has aspired to talk peace with two large separatist rebel groups, while ordering the military to destroy smaller factions that have tried to align with Daesh. Malte is one such group which bombed Duterte's home city of Davao in September, killing 15 people. The leader of its apparent alliance with Daesh is Isnilon Hapilon, who is on Washington's list of most wanted terrorists with a $5 million bounty on his head. Dozens of people have died in the fighting since the army raided his hideout last week. And now some fear a 60-day state of emergency may be extended indefinitely. A measure with a dark past in the Philippines.
The proclamation of martial law is not a military takeover. I'm happy to see that the reaction throughout the country is favorable. I have received hundreds and hundreds of telegrams from all corners of the Philippines congratulating you and incidentally me for the proclamation of martial law, for the sudden cessation of anarchy and of criminality throughout the land.
Nearly 10 years of martial law under Ferdinand Marcos ushered in an era of human rights abuses in the Philippines. Now, more than 30 years later, some fear that President Rodrigo Duterte's drug war is showing some of the same ghastly features. And with a state of emergency in effect, there is now, in many people's eyes, more cause for concern. The threat appears to be real, and a native insurgency that goes back decades in Mindanao has drawn in foreigners from Malaysia and Indonesia. Something which raises the prospect of a new regional conflict. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
But is the threat of violence really at that scale? Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined from Sant Cugat, Spain, by Christian Herbolzheimer. He's the director of the Transitions to Peace program at Conciliation Resources, an international peace-building organization. Thanks very much for joining us. Before I ask you about martial law, I want to ask you about Duterte's rape comments. I mean, how much of it do you think is bluster, and how much of it is this real, genuine threat of him endorsing medieval tactics during this current onslaught?
Well, Duterte has been in power now for almost a year, and his language has probably what has made him most famous around the world, because it is obviously quite provocative, controversial, and I think people have got accustomed, at least in the Philippines now, that after each time he comes up with a very harsh statement, there's somebody, a spokesperson in government or somebody else, clarifying the real meaning of his words. He speaks a very tough language, but I think right now this tough language is addressed to this Daesh, alleged Daesh supporters in the city of Marawi. And the way he, at the beginning of his government, offered a carrot and dialogue, once they rejected it, what he's showing is the stick, what they will get because they wouldn't yield to conversations with him.
Yeah, so he says, and I quote him, "I cannot gamble with ISIS or Daesh because they are everywhere." To a certain extent, he's right, isn't it? Because they're not very compromising.
That's correctly true. So the question that people, so the declaration of martial law has raised many eyebrows and concerns in the Philippines mainly, I guess internationally as well, because of the reminder of what happened 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when martial law was declared by then President Marcos, which then led to dictatorship. But at the same time, it has been met with caution. There's not been big outrage protests against martial law. It is understood that there's a serious problem, a serious threat in Mindanao and elsewhere in the Philippines and in the world, and that something needs to happen. If the president thinks that martial law will help, well, people are giving him the benefit of the doubt now and are probably in a wait-and-see mode.
So you have this Abu Sayyaf, you have Isnilon Hapilon, who pledged allegiance to Daesh, and then you have the Maute group. There's points of agreement and there's points where they converge. So the government's fighting them. And then on the other hand, he's also telling the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and their old fighters, hey, if you want to join us and fight Daesh, we can help you. You can join us, right? So it's kind of fascinating the way, you know, these chess pieces are playing out right now. How's that gonna play out? Is he actually going to get the support of those former MILF fighters?
Well, whether that will be an active support in terms of fighting fellow Muslim Mindanaoans, we'll have to see. But in any case, there has been a very clear, there's three main rebel groups in the Philippines, two from the southern island of Mindanao, where we're talking about the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Moro National Liberation Front. And they have both signed peace agreements with the government. And they are therefore not interested with other groups taking on further and continued violence. What they are fighting for, this more established group, is for the implementation of agreements, which, by the way, government has been dragging their feet to implement. So they have verbally already expressed, distanced themselves from these new violent expressions and new groups. They may or may not join in their fight, depending on probably what else is in the chess game, as you have very well defined it, because you have to consider many pieces at the same time.
Yeah, so dozens dead. These guys are setting fire to churches. They're kidnapping people. The government's using airstrikes, choppers, tanks. The president's talking tough. Is this going to slip into a really ugly civil war? Do you fear that?
No, I don't think so, but there have been precedents of similar attacks in cities. We had just 4 years ago in the city of Zamboanga. At that time, a fraction from the Moro National Liberation Front taking hostage one part of the city, and that led to a quite ugly urban conflict. It didn't escalate to a war. It was contained in the city of Zamboanga, but it lasted for several weeks and brought with it vast destruction of the city. So of course that's telling you a story of difficulties in making, implementing agreements, like for a peace agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front in '96 and Moro Islamic Liberation Front in 2014. And when there's no implementation and the government is not able to translate words into deeds and people see the change, the benefits of peace, that creates an atmosphere where other groups can take on violence and still be able to recruit out of dissatisfaction of some sectors of society who still believe that the only solution is violence.
Tricky situation right now in the Philippines. Good to get your analysis, Christian Herbelsheimer. Thanks for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Next time, we look into whether Qatar is being isolated in the Gulf amid its growing rift with the GCC. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.